Hello and welcome to the Historical Geography of U.S. Presidential Elections. This lecture is part two of a larger lecture that covers the first party system, or the period between 1788 and 1820 or 1824, in many ways of reckoning the time period. This particular lecture will just look at two elections, two presidential elections, that of 1816 and 1820. And then we'll move on to look at the role of westward expansion and democratization in the ongoing political evolution of the United States and its presidency. And it will end with a discussion of the importance of James Madison. I personally think he's the most underrated of the founders. So in 1816, James Monroe wins a landslide election. This slide was included at the end of the previous lecture. And as I noted then, Monroe was the favorite candidate of Jefferson and Madison. He was one of the founders, although not one of the major founders, unlike his predecessors. Rufus King, his Federalist opponent, had a relatively strong anti-slavery stance, at least relative to the period of time. Did him relatively little good as well. Later on, slavery is going to become a much more important issue in U.S. presidential and congressional elections as well. But you could see it was quite a landslide, with Monroe getting 183 electoral votes to King's 34. And the popular vote, although, again, most states did not have a popular vote, but 72.9 versus 13.2. And King just taking a few states, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Delaware, which were the most Federalist-leaning states. Note that Louisiana is now a state as well. When we look at the limited county returns, note that even states that had a popular vote, all of the county returns were not saved, were not preserved. So Kentucky, Tennessee, for example, they're very partial. But equally important, in those states, in Virginia and most of North Carolina, you just see an overwhelming victory of Monroe. 90% are over. More mixed in Pennsylvania. Note that there are a few areas with unpledged electors. That's true in some of these counties in southern inland North Carolina that have been settled by the Highlander Scots, who tended to be quite loyal to the Federalist Party. But the Federalist Party is basically disappearing at this time. And we'll see in later lectures in this class that when local people didn't have a candidate that they could support, they often voted for unpledged electors, who then would simply decide who to cast their votes for when the time came. I won't talk a whole lot about what happened in Monroe's first term, but I will mention that towards the end of his first term, there was a pretty significant economic panic or depression, panic of 1819. It did him relatively little harm. I mean, he had an overwhelming victory in 1820. And that's unlike later economic panics or depressions. Not all of them, but many. Certainly 1837, 1893, and especially 1929. Whatever party was in power when one of these panics and depressions occurs is going to suffer in the next election. But that didn't happen this time. There's a lot of speculation of why 1819 saw the first economic panic in the United States. There was a bit of a global downturn after the Napoleonic Wars ended in 1815. And that's really not necessarily uncommon. During a war, there's a lot of inflationary pressures. Those who can export to warring countries, which a position the United States very often found itself in, could often reap certain benefits from that, although there are certain other problems that they suffered. But it takes a while for economies to restabilize after a period of intensive war. Particularly in the United States, there had been a tremendous amount of risky land speculation. I mean, this is going on all along as westward expansion is happening. There's a lot of investors speculating in the land. There's a lot of land being bought on credit. The Second Bank of the United States, which had been created under the administration of James Madison, grew a little bit nervous about that and curtailed a lot of these loans for Western lands. That resulted in bank runs and a real problem. It didn't last particularly long, and it didn't hurt Monroe. As you could see in the election of 1820, he runs unopposed. And that's only happened 3 times in U.S. Presidential political history. The 2 terms of George Washington and then this 1820 election, sometimes called the era of good feelings. Although sometimes that is used in a somewhat ironic sense, because even though the Federalist Party had mostly disappeared and was soon to disappear entirely, and people were coming on board with the Democratic Republican Party, and the war was over and times were improving, doesn't necessarily mean that, well, it didn't mean at all that factions disappeared. We're going to see in 1824 they come back in a major way. But this is marked by a period of sort of a triumph of economic nationalism and expansionism. Remember, the Federalists were not too keen on westward expansion. They were concerned about it. Well, with them being gone, westward expansion becomes the rallying cry of the day. Monroe wanted to eliminate political parties. He hearkened back to the founders, the original founders at any rate, who really had a fear of faction or political party and wanted them not to play a role in this new republic, although already before 1800 they realized that they were necessary, and Hamilton and Madison and Jefferson were all involved in the creation of the two political parties, Hamilton with the Federalists and Jefferson and Madison with the Democratic Republicans. But Monroe really thought with this uncontested election he could make this happen. And eliminating political parties really meant eliminating the Federalist Party. So one of the things he did was to deny political patronage appointments and other administrative appointments to Federalists, which Madison and Jefferson had done to some degree. There weren't a huge number of appointments. The size of the bureaucracy was minuscule by later standards, but yeah, there were still some, and they could be somewhat lucrative and desired. As a result of this policy, many Federalists just left the party and became Democratic Republicans to stay in on the possibility of these appointments. And that led to, yes, the end of the Federalist Party, but also increased the division of the Democratic Republic Republican Party into factions. The map of the popular presidential vote of 1820 is pretty limited, so a lot of states, most states, are still choosing their electors by the state legislatures rather than by the popular vote. And even where we do have popular vote, a lot of county returns did not survive. But one thing that's really interesting is just the disappearance of the Federalists from most areas. Massachusetts, still strong. Connecticut, though, which was at one time the most Federalist state, now every single one of its counties, popular vote was for the Democratic Republican Party, and by pretty substantial majorities. And you look in Pennsylvania, Virginia, North Carolina, just overwhelming. Not quite the same in Kentucky, though, and that's going to become important later on. Now, one of the reasons why this was an era of good feelings or so on, whatever we want to call it, resulted in a lot of enthusiasm for the United States, growing nationalism, a sense of many that the country was on the right track, was that under the presidency of James Monroe, there was a tremendous expansion of the territory of the United States. Not nearly as much as what had happened under Jefferson with the Louisiana Purchase, but we can see purple areas here acquired under the Monroe administration. It was a process led not by the president, but by the Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, who had left the Federalist Party of his father, John Adams, back in 1807, because the Federalist Party wasn't expansive and nationalistic enough for him, and joined the Democratic Republican Party. Very accomplished diplomat, becomes Secretary of State, which is the most powerful position in the government after the presidency. So it's interesting what he was able to acquire from Spain, Florida, but Florida at that time included much more than what is now Florida. It included the southern parts of Louisiana and Mississippi, and even a chunk of Louisiana. That was recovered. It was acquired from Spain. Spain was losing its empire in the Americas at this time, at least its empire on the main continental landmasses of North and South America. And Spain was eager to negotiate. But there was also a separate deal made with the United Kingdom And you could see a small area that had been part of the Louisiana Purchase that's ceded to Britain, and then a much larger area that the United States acquired. Previously, the boundary, and a lot of these boundaries were sort of notional at this time because the territory is actually controlled by indigenous peoples, but the U.S. and the U.K. were sort of looking into the future. And original Louisiana Purchase, the territories were based on watersheds, and in this new situation, it's going to be based much more, well, sometimes on watersheds, but in the case of the U.S., what has become the U.S.-Canada border, simply along the 49th parallel of latitude. This was a very good deal for the United States because that purple territory up there includes the Red River of the North that goes between North Dakota and Minnesota, which is very fertile farmland, whereas the area ceded to Great Britain is quite dry Great Plains area, useful for extensive weed and grazing, but not nearly as agriculturally rich or as populated. So it's important to note here, you could say there was land lost under Monroe. Part of the Louisiana Territory was ceded back to Spain in the south. I have labeled that Comancheria because this territory was actually the heart of the lands of the Comanche Nation, indigenous or Indian American group, which was unassailable until after the Civil War. Comanche were a very powerful group of people. Very interesting recent book written by a historian named Pekka Hämäläinen called Comanche Empire. I don't really think it was an empire, but it was a strong state-like entity. So again, just to show you the Adams-Onis Treaty, Adams because it was negotiated by John Quincy Adams, or the Florida Purchase Treaty, and you could see the extensive areas gained by the United States. Not only did the United States gain territory under Monroe and John Quincy Adams as Secretary of State, but 5 new states were added. So I show here in the dark gray pre-existing states, future states in light gray, and then these 5 states that are added. And that's more states than any other president except Benjamin Harrison in the 1880s. So anyway, it was a several-step process. First, 2 slave states were added, Mississippi and Alabama, and 1 free, Illinois. And that created a balance of 11 free states and 11 slave states. So increasingly, the free and slave states are fighting over the expansion of slavery into new territories. And the North did not want slavery to expand, and the South definitely did. And so there were a lot of compromises. This is part and parcel of a larger compromise called the Compromise of 1820. It happened a little bit earlier. So 3 new states come in, and then Missouri applies for statehood. So Missouri is west of the Mississippi River, but it had been, as I mentioned in the previous lecture, it had some French settlement in it, and those French settlers, many of them owned slaves, and then people started moving in from the slave states of the United States, Kentucky, Tennessee in particular, bringing their enslaved workers with them, and especially in central Missouri, along the Missouri River, established a plantation agriculture zone. So the representatives from the free states did not want Missouri to be admitted. That would have undone the balance. So a compromise was made where Maine was split off from Massachusetts and entered the United States as a separate free state, so that maintained the balance. But the issue still remained about what would be done with slavery in the rest of the territory of the former Louisiana Purchase, unorganized territory, you could see here. And so to round out the Compromise of 1820, or Missouri Compromise, as it sometimes is called, was the idea that Missouri would enter as a slave state, but no further slave states would be admitted north of Missouri's southern boundary, 36 degrees 30 minutes north latitude. And so that would have allowed slavery in Arkansas, which was not yet organized as a state, but not north of that line. And that compromise held for some time. It's going to break down in a big way in the 1850s, and that was one of the things that led to the Civil War. Meanwhile, in mainland Latin America, Portugal and Spain are losing their empires. Spain maintains an empire in Cuba and in Puerto Rico all the way up to the end of the 1800s, but by 1820 it's pretty much over with. It takes a while for Spain to lose these wars, but eventually in the 1820s, large number of new republics emerge. Many of them modeled to some extent on the United States in terms of their political form. The U.S. revolution against the United Kingdom was seen as quite an inspiration to Simon Bolivar and others fighting for independence from Spain. The United States was concerned about this, and they were really worried that other European countries would come in and recolonize them. That France or other states would have an interest in this. And what the United States wanted was independent Latin American states with which the United States could trade and have a somewhat dominant position, if you like. And the result of this was the Monroe Doctrine associated with President Monroe, but it was written again by the Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams. And the basic idea of the Monroe Doctrine was that the United States would not object to any existing European colonies in the Americas, because Spain and Portugal were not the only countries. Britain, France, Dutch Republic, all had colonies in the Caribbean and even on the mainland of northern South America were being formed at this time. So anyway, the Monroe Doctrine said, well, that's fine, but any recolonization efforts of states that had become independent republics would be resisted by the United States. And the Monroe Doctrine is going to figure prominently for decades after that. I mean, here we can see a cartoon from 1896. Uncle Sam stands with a rifle between Europeans and Latin Americans with a no trespassing sign. Rather insulting cartoon in many ways. But when the Monroe Doctrine was forged by John Quincy Adams, the United States lacked any kind of military force necessary to make it real, to enforce it. The U.S. regular army was 6,000 to 7,000 soldiers, and they were focused on fighting indigenous peoples, not on European powers. The Navy had fewer than 20 warships, and they were focused on protecting U.S. shipping interests, especially in the Mediterranean, where there was a lot of piracy. They certainly couldn't have prevented France, for example, moving into Latin America. But one country that could prevent that was the United Kingdom, which by this time had by far the world's largest navy. It had established that in the early 1700s with something called the War of Spanish Succession. But the United Kingdom really didn't have any naval rivals for a long time. That map is anachronistic. I mean, it shows the situation in 1914. But the UK had was already establishing these overseas naval bases and had the Navy that could prevent that, or at least make it very difficult for a country. So the Monroe Doctrine was successful in that sense. By 1824, and I'll talk about this in the next lecture at some length, the era of good feelings is certainly coming to an end. And one of the first things that sort of signposted that was the failure of the presidential nomination system. So the way it had worked for the parties to nominate their presidential candidates was to have a caucus of the members of Congress of that party. So for many elections, the Federalists would get together in Congress in Washington and determine who they would put forward as candidate for president, and after the 12th Amendment, vice president as well. And in 1824, the Democratic Republican Congressional Congress nominated William Crawford of Georgia. I'll talk about him next time. He was favored by Madison and Jefferson, who are getting, certainly Jefferson is only going to live a couple more years, but they still have quite a bit of influence. But it didn't work because only 66 of the 240 Democratic Republican representatives in Congress chose to participate. Why did the rest not? Well, democratization, the idea of democratization, at least for white men, is really intensifying and spreading. And it's now seen that this system is profoundly undemocratic. People wanted more representation in who is choosing the nominees, and not just to have such a narrow group. And so even though Crawford was selected, other leading political players throw their hat in the ring and decide to run. So I'll spend quite some time on this in the next lecture. I've just touched on it now. But John Quincy Adams, Secretary of State, Andrew Jackson, the the military hero who defeated the United Kingdom at the Battle of New Orleans in 1814, Henry Clay, he was one of the young war hawks, member of Congress in 1812, urging war. Becomes a very powerful congressman in Kentucky, and eventually is going to become quite soon is going to become one of the leaders in the creation of the Whig Party. And so anyway, they're all running and making deals, and it's quite a complicated situation, and it results in an election in which no candidate gets a majority in the Electoral Congress. It goes to the House of Representatives. John Quincy Adams is selected, but many people think he was selected because of a corrupt bargain where he was to go on to appoint Henry Clay Secretary of State. Again, very powerful position, and Henry Clay sort of threw his delegates in Adams' way. So this was not liked, especially by Andrew Jackson. But we'll talk about that in the next lecture. What I want to do with the rest of this lecture is talk about some of the sort of larger issues and processes that were changing the way the United States functioned politically, was organized geographically, and so on. And so first I'll emphasize the significance of Western expansionism, and then I want to end this lecture talking about James Madison in a little bit more detail. But as far as the era of democratization goes, I say 1820 here to 1840, more or less. But we can just see it in voter turnout in presidential elections of eligible voters. And you could see from 1820, 10%, 1824 jumping to almost 27, and then 1828, 53. By the time you get to 1840, voter turnout is over 80%, and this is one of the much higher than you have today of eligible voters. Now, of course, few people were eligible voters at that time, but property requirements or taxpayer requirements for voting, they're diminishing. They didn't really have them in the western states, and the eastern states are eliminating them. Or you can see here by 1836, all states except South Carolina, which was the most conservative, was going to continue to be for many years. They maintained the situation where the state legislature would pick electors, but in every other state, it was popular vote, and you could see some interesting and complex geographical patterns that I'll talk about at some length later on. As I mentioned before, but I just want to reiterate, this admission of Western states helped propel democratization. The Eastern states had all had pretty highly developed social hierarchies, class systems. Well, of course, so did the entire country was sort of class divided, but the class divisions were deeper in the older states that had originally been colonies. In the Western states, you've got a more equitable distribution of land as settlers are coming in, acquiring land, turning it into farms. So the yeoman farmer idolized by Jefferson and Madison becomes a more sort of powerful force in the West, and they do not want to have these qualifications for voting. They want all white men to be able to vote, and they want to have more direct elections. And it's happening at many levels in the United States at this time. Local levels, more political participation, more democratization. We can sort of see it all over the place. And I'm just showing the new states here added by 1821. The process of Western expansion was driven by a huge increase in population, and it came from two ways. One was immigration, which was substantial, but more important than that was just the extraordinarily high birth rate. You can see the total fertility rate of the United States, that would be the average number of children per woman, was about 7. Right now in the world, that would be one of the highest rates in the world. Yes, there was a pretty high infant and child mortality rate, 30% or more. But even with that, with a total fertility rate of 7, that's going to result in very rapid population growth. So these maps that I borrowed from an animated series, I have the at the bottom. You can see where to find the actual animation. So I just took still shots. But you can see in 1792 in the United States is just in its infancy. Most of the non-indigenous population in the to the east of the Appalachian Mountains, but already we're getting several areas, western Pennsylvania, north central Kentucky, the Bluegrass region, central Tennessee. We're getting Euro-American settlements to the west of the Appalachian Mountains, and then a great increase. Well, yeah, look at the the population of the U.S. In 1790, just under 4 million, with 700,000 enslaved. By 1820, getting close to 10 million, with 1.5 million enslaved. And you can see how Western expansion is increasing. It's not just a simple movement to the west, though. You could see much more sort of in the central part of the country. Like I mentioned before, Tennessee and Kentucky were early settled. You could see here more settlement into Missouri than say in Michigan. So it's going to take a little longer for areas further north and south. Also, you could see a concentration to some extent in Louisiana, which built on those old French antecedents. And then by 1840, again, 17 million, 2.5 million enslaved. And so the western states, by this time you could see relatively high density in places like Ohio, in southern Indiana. And this is, again, something that's propelling the democratization process. I want to talk a little bit as well about James Madison. I have here greatest but most overlooked founder. This is my personal view, but I might as well spend a little bit of time expanding on that. So Mount Rushmore, yeah, we don't have Madison. No surprise. I mean, you can only put a few presidents on a mountain like that. But what I do find astounding is not on any currency, any current currency. Madison was on a $5,000 bill, but that's a bank bill, essentially. These were never circulated in the public. So no coin, no bill, which is kind of surprising considering, I mean, he was the author of the Constitution, essentially. It was his doing. Was one of the two main authors of the Federalist Papers, along with Alexander Hamilton. And the Federalist Papers were absolutely crucial in getting the Constitution adopted and turning the United States into a sovereign federation rather than a loosely grouped confederation of essentially sovereign states. So, extraordinarily important in that regard. And this is all very well known. But what is less known was his importance in foregrounding what is known as the Scottish Enlightenment. So by Enlightenment, what we mean by that is the movement in many parts of Europe in the 18th century, in the 1700s, toward a more rationalistic understanding of the universe, a movement away from strictly religious thinking about how the world is created and how it functions. There are different enlightenments. You can certainly talk about an American Enlightenment with Benjamin Franklin as well as the founders who I've been talking about. But the most important, most scholars would agree, would be the French Enlightenment, associated with writers like Voltaire in France, but also the Scottish Enlightenment. Scotland more than England. There were certainly Enlightenment figures in England, but Scotland produced more of them. And if you're interested, I greatly recommend Arthur Herman's book, How the Scots Invented the Modern World, the true story of how Western Europe's poorest nation created our world and everything in it. Now, that's an exaggeration, a tremendous exaggeration. Certainly, they did not create our world and everything in it, but they were very influential. Scotland in the 1700s was well, it had been a very poor country. In fact, it was essentially bankrupt in the early 1700s when Scotland tried to create its own colonial empire in Panama, which was a catastrophic failure. Most people died of yellow fever and malaria. The state was bankrupt and was forced to join England, which they had been under the same monarchs as England for a while, but they were different countries. And this was hard for the Scots to tolerate, but they really had no option. So 1707 was the Act of Union. That's when the United Kingdom was created. The Union Jack originally formed by taking the red cross of St. George, which was the flag of England, and the blue diagonal cross of St. Andrew, the flag of Scotland, putting them together, and that was the original Union Jack. Later they add the cross of St. Patrick of Ireland, but well, that's another story. But Scotland was probably the most literate society in Europe at that time, maybe in the world. The Scottish Presbyterian Church, a Calvinist church, really emphasized the importance of everyone being able to read the Bible in translation. And so it was necessary to have widespread literacy. They developed a much more forward-looking university system. Oxford and Cambridge in England were basically schools for training clergy and sort of finishing schools for gentlemen. But as far as a university as a place for intellectual exploration and discovery, Scotland was well ahead. So there are many figures of the Scottish Enlightenment. David Hume, most important philosopher of the period. Adam Smith, who wrote The Wealth of Nations, essentially invented modern economics. James Hutton, who essentially invented modern geology, speculating, and well, not just speculating, deducing evidence for a long age of the Earth and so on. And these are just some of many, many figures. It was a very vibrant intellectual scene, both in Edinburgh and Glasgow, and pretty close together. As Herman notes, this is very interesting, these writers all originally were people who did not speak standard English. They spoke Scots dialect of English, but a dialect so different that it's really not mutually interintelligible. So they had to essentially learn a new language, a new spoken language, to be able to join the greater sort of British intellectual sphere, but which they did in a big way. So just to give you some of the difference between the French Enlightenment and the Scottish Enlightenment, and these are all exaggerated, but they have an element of truth. The French Enlightenment tended to be much more radical, the Scottish Enlightenment more reformist. The French Enlightenment often stressed the natural goodness of humanity, and that's especially true with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who is sometimes regarded as a post-Enlightenment figure, but he's definitely of the time period. Whereas the Scots said moral behavior must be nurtured and shaped. French Enlightenment, many of the thinkers stressed the importance of education for sort of liberation of the individual. Scottish Enlightenment, education more equally important for moral improvement and civic duty. And maybe most important, the French Enlightenment tended to be highly skeptical of religion, if not anti-religious, and very rationalistic, at least before Rousseau, in its understanding of the world, where the Scottish Enlightenment, most of the thinkers thought that religion has very important benefits, and they definitely did move away from the stern Calvinist Presbyterianism of their predecessors, but they remained within the Presbyterian fold in general, and incorporated, brought together rationalism and religion, if you will. And they also really believed in the importance, at least many of them, the importance of moral intuition. There are many strains of thought within the Scottish Enlightenment, but the one that was most important for Madison in the United States was something known as common sense realism, and it came out of debates within Scotland itself. So David Hume, the famous Scottish philosopher, was very much a skeptic, and others, and particularly Thomas Reid, were opposed to that kind of skepticism. So Reid argued that there are basic beliefs and perceptions that all normal human beings share, and they do not need to be proven by philosophical argument. And Jefferson put this very clearly in the Declaration of Independence, where he said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident. We don't need to prove them. This is something that any human being with basic mental capacity, adults, could understand." Now, that's obviously not everybody is going to agree with that, but it's pretty essential to the founding of the United States. So it wasn't just Madison who was part and parcel of this, but Madison more than anyone else. And this common sense realism really was institutionalized in the United States at a particular place, Princeton University, and by one person in particular, John Witherspoon, who was the sixth president of Princeton. It was a tiny little university at this time, but it was associated with the Scottish Presbyterian faith. Originally a very Calvinist faith, but by this time it really moved away from that kind of stern Calvinism. But it had many aspects of that earlier thought. Witherspoon was the only active clergyman and the only college president to sign the Declaration of Independence, but he is counted as one of the founders for having done this. And he really made Princeton a center of this sort of new Scottish thought, that Princeton is going to be sort of on the forefront of intellectual trends for quite some time. Madison himself was first privately tutored by a Scots, sort of a local tutor who had been exposed to this kind of thinking. And then he goes to Princeton, which is unusual. Someone from his sort of Virginia planter society, they're going to go to college, that would be expected. It would have been William and Mary. But he went north to New Jersey, went to Princeton, and was tutored by Witherspoon and others as well. But Princeton was really this, it was a handful of faculty members, but it was really associated with this Scottish Enlightenment. And Madison, you could see this in Federalist Paper number 51, where a very famous quote where Madison says, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary." Very unlike the thought of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who thought people would be angels if we just got rid of corrupting society and corrupting government and business and all of that. But that was not the thought of common sense realism. And common sense realism is to go on to become really a guiding American philosophy for decades, really until the late 1800s, when pragmatism associated with thinkers like William James begins to supplant it. But through most of the 19th century, through the 1800s, if you were going to sort of try to isolate a political or moral philosophy in the United States, it would be this Scottish common sense realism. So its importance is for the United States sort of intellectual life and just sort of the way people think about morality and government and interrelations with other people. Scottish common sense realism is really important. So I just want to emphasize that a bit. So I'm about done with this lecture. I'll go back to this slide, which I showed you before, with 1824, with the Democratic Republican parties sort of splintering in four different important candidates. And I'll spend quite a bit of time in the next lecture on this particular election. But what's really important to note about it is the U.S. Constitution, you have to win a majority in the electoral Congress to win. At this time in 1824, you needed 131 electoral votes. And you could see Andrew Jackson got 99, John Quincy Adams got 84, Crawford got 41, Henry Clay got 37. So nobody was really even close. So it has to go to the House of Representatives. They have to pick somebody state by state. and John Quincy Adams is selected. As I mentioned before, Henry Clay gives him support. Clay becomes Secretary of State. Andrew Jackson denounces it as a corrupt bargain, and Andrew Jackson then sets his sight on the presidency in 1828, which he is successful in, and that results in really pretty substantial changes. The creation of what is sometimes called often called the second party system. Jackson changes sort of the party affiliation, no longer the Democratic Republican Party, but it becomes the Democratic Party. Jackson is usually considered the founder of the modern Democratic Party, whereas Clay and John Quincy Adams form what they call the National Republican Movement. That's not going to really work, but it's going to become the core of what later becomes the Whig Party. And through the rest of the period up until the election of 1856, are going to have the Whigs vying against the vying against the Democrats, and that is quite similar in many ways to the previous division between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, with the Whigs being more like the Federalists, but not entirely. The Whigs are very much we'll look at all of these issues in subsequent lectures. So thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this lecture, and I hope you will tune into later lectures on the topic of the historical geography of U.S. presidential elections. Thank you.